The war had been going on for 300 cycles, so long that neither the Kryll nor the Vorlag could remember who started it. The planets and entire star systems burned up in the crossfire, leaving only ash and memory. The Kryll Empire's chrome fleets and geometric warships fought like math, cold, planned, and completely effective. Every loss was acceptable as long as it moved their strategic position forward, even by a small amount. Their homeworld was full of silver towers that rose above the clouds. These towers were symbols of logic and technological superiority. The Vorlag Dominion told a different story on the other side of the border. Their red ships, decorated with symbols of their ancestors and battle scars that looked like medals, charged into battle with songs of glory ringing through their halls. It was honorable to die in battle. It was worse than death to retreat. Their culture was based on warrior codes that had been passed down through the years. Their armor had the names of fallen heroes written in flowing script on it. The Kryll saw tactical benefits, but the Vorlag saw blood debts that could only be paid back in kind. Their never-ending hatred hurt the whole galaxy. Trade routes fell apart as merchant ships left war zones. On neutral worlds, the number of refugees grew, their eyes empty from the trauma of losing their homes to orbital bombardments and ground attacks. Children grew up knowing only sirens and shelters, and their nights were lit up by explosions far away. Over the years, mediators from a dozen different species tried to talk about peace, but each time they failed. The Kryll thought that emotional appeals were not logical. The Vorlag turned down any deal that didn't respect their honor. People watched from the edges, a new species that had only been part of galactic society for 2 generations. The older civilizations were both curious and condescending toward humans. They thought it was strange how these newcomers made emotional connections with anyone and anything and insisted on finding common ground even when it didn't seem to exist. The Kryll thought that humans were not very efficient because they were so unpredictable. The Vorlag thought that people who didn't want to be warriors were weak. But the older species had forgotten something in the thousands of years they had lived. In their art, stories, and music, people carried something. Even Ambassador Alara Vance didn't fully understand that truth, but she did. The human diplomatic corps chose Alara not because she was good at politics but because her master's thesis was about how different cultures express themselves through music. She had spent years studying how different species reacted to rhythm, melody, and harmony. Her research indicated that music could be the singular universal language, transcending the intellectual barriers that segregated civilizations. When the Galactic Council called for yet another peace summit, everyone thought it would end the same way, with failure and more violence. The Kryll and Vorlag only agreed to go because their economies were finally feeling the effects of years of military spending. Neither side wanted to give in. They only came to explain their points of view to the galaxy that was watching. Alara got her assignment on a cold morning in New Geneva, which is where Earth's diplomatic headquarters are. With a sad look on his face, her boss, an older man with tired eyes, gave her the brief. He said, "They're sending you because they can afford to lose you. The big powers have tried everything. Threats of war, economic sanctions, and philosophical debates. Nothing works. So they're letting a junior ambassador from a small species have a go, even though they know it won't matter if she fails." That night, she stood at the window of her room and watched Earth turn below. The lights of cities looked like stars that had fallen to the ground. She held her most prized possession in her hands, a harmonic lyra, an instrument her grandmother had made from scrap materials during the resource wars. It was a simple thing, strings stretched across a curved frame. It could make sounds that ranged from crystal-clear chimes to deep, resonant tones that felt like they were vibrating in the chest. Music had stopped fights on Earth before. Maybe it could do the same thing in space. It took 2 weeks to get to the summit. Alara practiced every day in her cabin, her fingers dancing across the strings as she looked for melodies that might speak to people who thought in math or lived by codes of honor. She looked at recordings of Kryll talking to each other. Their language was like math, with each word having a clear meaning. She listened to Vorlag battle chants, which were like poetry and drums. Each sentence was like a small show. Alara felt the weight of impossibility settle on her shoulders when her ship finally docked at Nexus Station, the neutral ground chosen for the summit. The viewing decks at the station gave a clear view of both fleets. The Kryll ships were arranged in perfect geometric shapes, while the Vorlag ships were in aggressive battle formations, with their weapons charged and shields up even though this was supposed to be a peaceful space. The wreckage of past encounters floated between them, and the debris fields sparkled like frozen tears in the starlight. The Kryll delegation met Alara in a room that was so clean that it hurt to look at it. There were no rough edges on any of the surfaces. They were all smooth metal or clear crystal. Every angle was exactly 90 degrees or a small fraction of that. The light was set to a range that the KRYL thought was best for cognitive function, so it didn't feel warm. The leader of the delegation, a being named Techron 7, looked at her with eyes that could process information faster than human neurons could fire. As he moved, the mechanical parts of his body clicked and whirred softly. The chrome and flesh were so well integrated that it was hard to tell where biology ended and technology began. Ambassador Vance, Techron 7's voice came through a translator that took away any emotional tone, making his words sound like pure data. Your credentials show that you are an expert in making auditory patterns. We don't understand how this kind of specialization can help diplomats settle military conflicts. Please give a logical framework for the method you suggest. Alara was ready for this. She didn't fight or try to explain. The KRYL would just look at it and throw it away. Instead, she took the harmonic lyra out of its case and carefully set it on the conference table. In this room with hard edges and harder logic, the instrument looked almost delicate. Its wooden frame felt warm and natural next to the cold metal. I ask for permission to show, she said plainly. Techron 7's head tilted in a way that could have meant curiosity in a species that said it didn't feel it. Go ahead. We will watch and think about it. She started with a simple pattern that was very precise in its math. A series of notes that followed the Fibonacci spiral, with each note building on the last in a way that could be seen in nature and, she hoped, in KRYL neural architecture too. She plucked the strings with a careful rhythm, and the room filled with sounds that bounced off the hard surfaces, making harmonics that the room's designers had never thought of. The KRYL group stopped moving. Their extra eyes stopped their constant tiny movements. The mechanical parts of Techron 7 stopped clicking. Alara counted down from 17 seconds of complete silence as the music played for beings who said they only cared about logic and efficiency. After the melody stopped, Techron 7 stayed still for a moment longer. Then his translator came to life, but his voice had something new in it that the machine couldn't quite filter out. Out of the blue. The pattern creates resonance. Our brains register the sequence as beautiful, even though beauty is not a logical parameter. Explain this event. Beauty is where pattern and change meet, Alara said softly. Too much order makes things dull. Too much chaos turns into noise. Music is what brings things together. Peace does too. She thought she saw something flash across Techron 7's face, or maybe she did. But when he spoke again, he didn't dismiss what the other person said. Instead, he asked a question. You think this resonance can be understood by both our species and the Vorlag? Alara said, I think there are truths that go beyond words or numbers. Things that can only be said in sounds and silence. The meeting with the Vorlag was completely different. Their room was full of heat and color. There were banners on the walls with the symbols of 100 warrior clans. Each one told stories of victories and honorable deaths. The air smelled like incense and something sharp, like the smell of people who lived always on the edge of battle. The Vorlag were almost 3 meters tall, and their scales shone like polished gems. Their eyes burned with a fire that made Alara's heart race. Commander Bractos, who was in charge of their group, looked at her with open doubt. His voice sounded like thunder far away. Do the humans send us a musician? We are warriors, not kids who need simple songs to keep them busy. Are you making fun of our honor with this rude gesture? Alara had learned from the KRYL that actions sometimes spoke louder than words. Before Bractos could tell her to stop, she raised the harmonic lyra and started to play. But this time she picked a different song, one with a strong rhythm, rising crescendos, and sudden changes that made it sound dramatic. She played the feeling of being on a battlefield, where you feel both scared and brave, and proud to be fighting against impossible odds with friends by your side. The music echoed through the Vorlag chamber, and each note was played with passion instead of mathematical accuracy. Alara's fingers bled from how hard she was playing, and the Vorlag noticed. That was important. For them, anything worth doing was worth getting hurt for. She put a lot of feeling into the strings, building up to a climax that talked about hard-won victory, meaningful sacrifice, and glory that would last for generations. There was silence in the air like smoke after a fight when she was done. After that, Bractos did something that surprised everyone in his group. He put his huge hand over his heart as a sign of deep respect, a salute only given to warriors who had fought and won. You don't make fun of us, he said, his voice no longer angry. You honor us with your blood and your love. Even though you don't have a sword, this is a warrior's gift. He stopped for a moment, and his scaly face changed into something that looked like confusion. But I don't get what you're trying to do. How does your music help bring about peace? We are not the kind of people who give up, no matter how beautiful the song is. Alara said, I don't want you to give up, as she wrapped her bleeding fingers in cloth. I ask you to think about why you are fighting. Is it for pride? For your people? Or is it just that you don't remember how to be any other way? The question hung in the air between them, full of meaning. Braktos's jaw tightened, and the warriors behind him shifted nervously. We fight because the Kryll destroyed Vorlag Prime 200 years ago. Because they don't follow the warrior's code and don't show honor. Because stopping the fight would be disrespectful to every ancestor who died defending our way of life. And if I told you that the Kryll feel the same way in their own way? That they fight because stopping would mean that all the sacrifices they made were for nothing? That you are both stuck in a cycle where neither side can afford to stop because it would make all the deaths that came before it meaningless? I would then say that you don't know anything about honor. But Braktos's voice didn't sound sure. His eyes had become distant, and for the first time he wondered if the deaths of the warriors he had lost had really brought him anything of value. Elara spent the next 3 days going back and forth between the two groups, learning about their pasts, their complaints, and their pain. She found out that both sides were tired, but neither would ever say so. The Kryll's calculations of their resources showed that their empire was having a hard time keeping up with the war effort. The Vorlag's warrior clans were running out of young fighters who were willing to die for a war that none of them had started. But more importantly, she found something else. Pieces of a shared past that were so deeply buried in both cultures that they had been forgotten. In the Kryll archives, there were old star charts that matched the poetic references in Vorlag songs. Both of their early buildings used similar mathematical constants. Evidence suggests that, maybe millions of years ago before either species had learned how to travel through space, their ancestors may have met, shared knowledge and culture, and then been separated by some unknown disaster that changed them into the civilizations they are today. She gave this proof to each delegation separately and watched how they reacted. The Kryll processed the data quickly as usual, but she noticed that Techron 7's enhanced eyes were still on the overlapping patterns. The Vorlag listened to her read old poems that were similar to their own battle poems, and some of the warriors were so moved that they didn't even realize it. Elara said at a meeting she had gotten both sides to go to, "There was a time before the war and the empires, when your people shared something. I don't know what happened to end that link. But I know that somewhere in your past, in your very DNA, you remember what it was like to not be enemies." "Sentiment," Techron 7 said, but his voice was shaky. "Historical data does not change the way things are now." Braktos agreed, "The past is dead. Honor only matters now." "Then let me show you something that connects the two." Elara picked up her harmonic lyra again. "I've learned about your cultures, histories, music, and math. And I've written something new. A piece that combines Kryll harmonic sequences with Vorlag battle rhythms. A song that could only be made if both of your civilizations helped make it." She started playing before they could say anything. The Kryll liked the melody because it was mathematically precise, with clean intervals, perfect ratios, and notes that followed predictable patterns. But then the rhythm changed, adding the driving pulse of Vorlag war chants and the passionate crescendos that spoke to their warrior hearts. Logic and passion, calculation and emotion, Chrome and Crimson shouldn't have worked together. But they did. The music got louder and each culture's part made the other stronger. The Kryll sequences gave the Vorlag rhythms a structure that made them soar higher than they could on their own. The Vorlag passion brought Kryll math to life, turning cold equations into things that moved the heart. And underneath it all, Elara wove in those old patterns she had found, the shared musical DNA that both cultures had forgotten they had. Something amazing happened in the audience. A Kryll engineer started tapping one of his mechanical appendages to the beat without even realizing it. A Vorlag warrior shut her eyes, and her scales sparkled with feelings that had nothing to do with battle rage. Techron 7 and Braktos didn't move, but their faces had changed from hostile doubt to something else, maybe recognition. Or remembering something that has been lost for a long time. The idea was so crazy that it was almost crazy. Elara stood in front of both delegations in the big summit room. Even though she was scared, her voice was steady. "I'd like to ask for permission to put on a joint performance. Musicians from the Kryll Empire and the Vorlag Dominion playing music together. One piece of music that shows how well your cultures can work together." People from all sides quickly raised their objections. Kryll delegates listed the logical impossibilities, such as instruments that don't work together, musical theories that don't agree, and the basic inefficiency of working together as artists. Vorlag commanders talked about honor and tradition, saying that their battle songs were sacred and shouldn't be mixed with the cold math of their enemies. But Elara had friends now, even if they didn't know it yet. Techron 7 had been looking at recordings of her music for the past 2 nights, and his cognitive processors had been running simulations to see how the harmonic patterns changed KRLL's neural chemistry. He couldn't deny the data. The music made KRL subjects who listened to it better at solving problems creatively and working together across departments. Braktos had quietly asked his clan's historians about the old verses Elara had mentioned. He found whole archives of pre-war culture that his people had set aside in favor of pure warrior tradition. One performance, Techron 7 finally said. We will send 3 KRYL experts in harmonic engineering. We won't have lost much if the effort fails. Braktos growled low in his chest, and the sound made a few delegates reach for weapons that weren't there. He then threw his head back and laughed, which was a loud noise that shook the walls. Okay, human. You have shown warrior spirit even though you don't have a sword. The Vorlag will send us the best singers of battle songs. At least it will be a glorious failure if this doesn't work. The next week was full of impossible talks that I couldn't remember. Elara had to act as a go-between for a KRL sound engineer who spoke only in math equations and a Vorlag drummer whose drum was made from the stretched hide of a huge beast and who thought every beat was a prayer for fallen warriors. There was a KRYL singer whose voice had been mechanically changed so that it could sing in perfect pitch across 17 octaves. There was also a Vorlag horn player whose instrument needed so much force to play that she had to brace it against the floor. The rehearsals were a complete mess. The KRYL musicians were angry when the Vorlag musicians wouldn't play the music exactly as it was written. The Vorlag artists felt limited by KRYL's insistence on perfect pitch and timing. Elara's translator had a hard time keeping up with the arguments that broke out in languages. The whole thing almost fell apart twice. But they kept coming back for some reason. It could have been pride. Neither side wanted to be the first to give up. Perhaps Elara was interested in these old connections that she had found. Or just maybe it was the music. When the KRYL horn and Vorlag drums found rhythms that worked well together, and when the mathematical vocals wove through passionate melodies, something magical happened. Elara worked 18-hour days, putting the composition together and taking it apart again and again. She found ways to let each musician shine while still serving the whole. She found out that the KRYL singer had joined the military band because his original career plans showed that music had the best chance of making a difference in the world, even though he had a lot of mechanical improvements. The Vorlag drummer had lost 3 brothers and sisters in the war, and she played to honor their memories. Each beat was a name she would never forget. She realized that they were people. Not just soldiers from warring empires but people with hopes, fears and dreams. The KRL engineer had a collection of musical instruments that had been salvaged from destroyed worlds. These instruments kept music that would have been lost otherwise. The Vorlag horn player wrote poems in secret that she never shared because they were about peace instead of glory. Elara made a choice the night before the show when everyone was tired and on edge. She asked each musician why they made music. Not for their empire or their culture but for themselves. What did music mean to them as individuals? The singer from KRL spoke first and for once his voice was soft. Music is the only field where beauty and efficiency are the same thing. The most beautiful way to get from one note to another is also the fastest. I can see that logic and emotion don't have to be at odds in music. Next was the Vorlag drummer, whose huge hands were gentle on the surface of her instrument. Music is sound that brings back memories. When I play, my brothers and sisters come back to life. My ancestors can hear me and know that I remember them. Music is how we fight death. The other people shared one by one. Elara heard the same truth in their words that she had found in her research. Music was important because it connected them to something bigger than themselves, something bigger than empires, wars and old hatreds. It reminded them that they were alive, that there was beauty in the world, and that even in the dark there was meaning. The show was set for the last day of the summit. Every delegate from both empires would be there, as well as representatives from many other civilizations who had come to see what most people thought would be a huge failure. The venue was the station's biggest amphitheater, a huge space that could hold thousands of people. Elara stood backstage with her strange orchestra, feeling the weight of hundreds of years on her shoulders. If this didn't work, the war would go on. More planets would catch fire. More generations would grow up only knowing war. But if it worked, they might be able to show that understanding was possible and that shared beauty could bring even the biggest differences together. Techron 7 said, "We're ready," and his metal parts shone in the stage lights. Braktos said, "We will make our ancestors proud." For the first time in decades of war, his scales were painted in ceremonial colors. The curtain went up. The amphitheater was quiet. Thousands of eyes from 100 different species were on the stage, where sworn enemies stood side by side with their instruments ready. Elara picked up her harmonic lyra and played the first few notes. The music started with one Kryll tone that was clear, mathematical, and crystalline. It hung in the air like a newly born star, perfect in its solitude. Then the Vorlag drums answered with a heartbeat rhythm that spoke of life, passion, and not giving up. The two sounds should have fought. Instead, they moved around each other like binary stars, separate but held together by forces that couldn't be seen. Elara rode her lyra between them, her song a bridge between chrome precision and crimson passion. The Kryll horn joined in, playing notes that were meant to make perfect harmonic intervals. The Vorlag horn's loud, powerful blasts added texture and urgency. The singer with the mechanical enhancements started a song without words that followed mathematical patterns but somehow got across feelings that no equation could. The audience was spellbound. Kryll delegates, who had come ready to analyze and criticize, found that their enhanced processors were only recording every note and couldn't turn the experience into data. Vorlag commanders who had hoped for either victory or honorable defeat, felt tears welling up in their eyes, tears they couldn't explain and wouldn't admit. The piece told a story without using words. It told the story of two civilizations that left their home worlds, reached for the stars, found amazing things and faced terrifying things. It talked about a time in the past when ancient ancestors met for the first time, shared knowledge, and were amazed at how different they were and how much they could learn from each other. Then it talked about a disaster that no one knew about that drove them apart and turned friendship into suspicion and wonder into fear. The music got darker, showing years of fighting. The Kryll sequences became stiff and cold, giving up all beauty for the sake of efficiency. The Vorlag rhythms changed into war drums and blood-bought glory. The two musical lines went in different directions and fought each other, making a dissonance that hurt the listener's teeth. But then, slowly against all odds, they started to find each other again. A Kryll harmony that got softer to make room for Vorlag passion. A Vorlag rhythm that fit Kryll's precision perfectly. The music showed the warring empires what they had forgotten, that different didn't mean incompatible. That strength didn't come from beating the other person, it came from learning what they knew. The climax built up like a wave getting stronger. The Kryll was mathematically perfect, the Vorlag was passionately committed, and both gave it their all. The sounds filled the amphitheater, shaking the walls and making everyone there feel them in their chests. At that moment, the musicians weren't Kryll or Vorlag. They were artists making something that neither of them could have done alone. Elara had timed the last note to last exactly 17 seconds, which was the same amount of time that the Kryll had given her music during their first meeting. Then it went away, leaving behind a silence deeper than space itself. Nothing happened for a long time. The audience sat still, hardly breathing. The musicians stood on stage with their instruments down, and sweat shone on both Vorlag scales and Kryll chrome. They had done everything they could, and now they were waiting to see if it was enough. Then Techron 7 got up. His mechanical parts made a whirring sound as he got up, and his many eyes were fixed on the stage. He clapped his hands together, which is something that people would recognize as applause, even though Kryll culture didn't have a tradition of doing this. The loud metallic sound echoed through the amphitheater. Bractos got up next, and his huge body towered over everyone else. He put his hand over his heart as a warrior's salute, then yelled a battle cry that was also a cheer of victory. His warriors came with him and the sound was like thunder. Then everyone was standing, including Kryll, Vorlag, and the many other species that had come to watch. The applause grew like a storm, with whistles, cheers, and sounds from beings that humans had never heard before. Some people cried out loud. Some people were speechless, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Something even more amazing happened on stage. The Kryll singer turned to the Vorlag drummer and held out a shiny hand. She looked at it for a moment, this gesture from a being whose people had killed her brothers and sisters. Then she held it tightly, her scaled hand wrapping around his chrome fingers. "You play with honor," she said, her voice full of feeling. "You did better than what was expected of you," he said, which was probably the best thing a Kryll could say. The other musicians were doing the same thing, crossing the invisible lines that had kept them apart and showing respect and recognition. They had come to this stage as enemies. They were leaving it as something else, something they couldn't yet put into words. Elara stood off to the side, holding her harmonic lyra to her chest and watching everything happen. She had blood on her hands from playing, her voice was hoarse from giving directions for hours, and she thought she might pass out at any moment. But she had done it. They had done it. 300 years of words had failed to say what music had said. The next morning, the summit met again in a setting that was completely different. The hard, angry positions of the last few sessions had gone away. Kryll and Vorlag delegates were still sitting on opposite sides of the room, but the space between them no longer felt like a war zone. A few delegates nodded to their counterparts across the aisle. These were small gestures, but they were big changes in this situation. Techron 7 asked for the floor first. His translator crackled, but something had changed behind the mechanical voice. Last night's show has given us data we didn't expect. Kryll analysis teams have been working on our group's reaction to the musical presentation for the past few hours. The results are illuminating. He turned on a holographic screen that took up the whole center of the room. Mathematical models and neural scans showed the patterns of brain activity of Kryll audience members during the show. At exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds into the piece, when the Kryll and Vorlag instruments were in perfect harmony, our brains registered a state that has never been recorded before. The closest word in English would be joy. Both groups reacted in a wave. Joy was not a logical factor. Joy was not useful, measurable, or quantifiable. And yet it was there in the data without a doubt. Also, Techron 7 said, further analysis of historical archives, prompted by Ambassador Vance's research, has shown that there are big holes in our cultural database. Records show that there was a time about 2.3 million years ago that we call the Harmonic Era. During this time, Kryll civilization put a lot of value on both technological progress and artistic achievement. Then, without warning, all of this cultural growth came to an end. We don't have any information that explains this change. Bractos slowly rose, and his warriors watched him very closely. The Vorlag have found things like this too. Our clan historians spent the night digging through archives that we thought were not useful for training warriors. Commander Techron 7, we found songs. Old songs that talk about the time before blood, when Vorlag respected teachers and artists just as much as warriors. When our clans got together not to fight, but to have music and story festivals. His voice got rough with emotion that he didn't try to hide. These songs are about visitors from the sky, beings made of chrome and crystal who came in peace and taught people about math and engineering. In exchange, my ancestors taught them about honor, passion, and the power of community. The songs call this time, the Great Harmony. People in the chamber started talking in shock. Translators had a hard time keeping up as delegates from both sides started talking at the same time. The neutral observers leaned in, feeling like they were seeing something that had never happened before. Ilara didn't say anything, letting the news sink in. She had thought there was a connection and had found clues in her research, but hearing both civilizations admit it at the same time was more than she could have hoped for. We suggest a hypothesis, Techron 7 said, bringing order back with his mechanical power. That Kryll and Vorlag have a shared history of interaction. That our current conflict is a break from how we used to work together. And that this separation has hurt the cultures of both of our civilizations. Bractos said, the hypothesis has merit, something no Vorlag had ever said to a Kryll in living memory. But it doesn't explain the break. What disaster turned friends into enemies? And more importantly, can knowing about this shared past really change the way things are now? The question hung in the air, full of meaning. 300 years of war, billions of deaths, and the destruction of whole star systems. Could one night of music really make all of that go away? Can a shared past help people get past their current hate? A junior Kryll delegate raised a chrome appendage and asked to speak, which is almost never allowed in their strict hierarchy. In an unprecedented move, Techron 7 agreed. I am Nexus 49, stationed at the disputed Korvax system, the young Kryll said in a voice that sounded unsure. I took part in a fight against Vorlag forces last cycle. During the fight, I disabled a Vorlag ship and got ready to blow it up according to tactical rules. But then I got their distress signal. I heard them singing. Yes, they sang battle songs, but they also sang about going home. About families who are waiting for them. About dreams of peace. Nexus 49's many eyes looked around the room. I couldn't finish the order to destroy. I called it a tactical malfunction and told them the equipment had broken. It wasn't the equipment that failed, it was my belief that the enemy was just an obstacle to be removed. After hearing last night's performance, I know that my reaction was not a mistake. It was a sign of, I think the word for people is humanity. A Vorlag warrior suddenly stood up, her scales glowing with rage. My name is Korva and I am from the Crimson Blade clan. 6 months ago, I led an attack on a Kryll research station. We thought there would be automated defenses and machines that killed without thinking. Instead, I found Kryll researchers locked up in their lab, not with weapons but with musical instruments. Pieces saved from worlds that were destroyed. Her voice cracked a little. One KOL played a song on an old alien flute as my soldiers broke through their defenses. That was the saddest sound I have ever heard. She kept playing until my sword killed her. I didn't feel good about that kill. Since then I've carried her flute with me. I can't throw it away or forget her last song. The room was completely quiet. Delegates from both sides were hearing things they had never admitted before, that the enemy felt fear, hope, and loss, and that every battle took not only tactical resources but also thinking, feeling beings with internal lives as complicated as their own. Ilara finally spoke, and her voice was soft but clear. War puts people into groups: enemy, threat, target. Music helps us remember the truth that war tries to hide. Those beings who can make things beautiful, feel happy and sad, and hear harmony are not so different from us. She looked back and forth between Techron 7 and Bractos. You've both learned that your civilizations knew this once. The Great Harmony, the Harmonic Era, whatever you want to call it, there was a time when Kryll and Vorlag worked together to find the wonders of the universe. That connection was broken by something. I don't know what. But I do know this: you can't change the last 300 years. All that death and pain happened, and no amount of regret will change that. What do you suggest then? Bractos asked. We recognize our common past and our ability to make things beautiful. But right now we have border disputes, resource conflicts, and a blood debt that has been going on for 300 years that needs to be paid. Ilara said, I think you should ask a different question. Not, how do we pay off our debts from the past? But, what future do we want to make? That performance last night showed you something important. You can work together to make something that neither of you could do on your own. The question is if you have the guts to act on that chance. A vast galactic council chamber aboard Nexus Station, designed with high arching walls and a central holographic projection of data, charts and music waveforms. Atmosphere, no longer tense and hostile, the air carries the weight of history rediscovered and possibilities unfolding. Delegates sit in clusters, some leaning forward in rapt attention, others quietly exchanging looks across the aisle. Key characters. Techron 7 stands at a podium, arm extended toward a glowing hologram displaying neural scans marked with the label 1743, Emotional Spike, JOY. His mechanical eyes reflect data streams. Bractos, towering in ceremonial armor, eyes wet with memory, raises an ancient Vorlag data slate etched with songs from the time before blood. Corva, somber but proud, lifts the fragile alien flute before the assembly, standing beside Nexus 49, who looks conflicted but brave. Ilara, positioned between both factions, is framed in soft lighting. Her harmonic lyra rests beside her, a symbol of the bridge built through music. Visual style, hyper-realistic, ultra-detailed sci-fi, cinematic lighting with soft blue, crimson and gold tones. Subtle lens flares from the holographic projectors. Strong use of contrast between polished Kryll design and primal Vorlag ornamentation. There was no easy or quick way to get from that point to real peace. Centuries of fighting had made both sides have vested interests. For example, military leaders whose power depended on the war going on, industries that made weapons, and politicians whose careers were based on making people afraid of the enemy. They did everything they could to stop the peace process, including using propaganda, sabotage, and even violence in some cases. There were some problems. A Kryll extremist blew up a cultural exchange center, killing 5 human mediators and 17 Vorlag artists. Vorlag hardliners killed a council member who pushed too hard for peace. Battle fleets on both sides, led by commanders who wouldn't accept the ceasefire, kept fighting in remote systems from time to time. But something had changed at its core. The recording of the resonator was played on both empires, and no amount of propaganda could change what millions had seen. Their ancestors were friends, not enemies. Young people on both sides, sick of a war they didn't start but had to fight, started to make their own connections. Musicians worked together across borders. Scientists wrote research papers together. Artists made pieces that combined elements from both cultures. Ilara was at the center of a growing web of programs that let people from different cultures meet and learn from each other. She taught human diplomats how to use music to get around intellectual barriers and speak directly to emotional truth. The harmonic lyra became a symbol of the peace process, and its image could be seen on everything from government seals to protest signs. Formal peace agreements were signed a year after the summit. The ceremony took place at Nexus Station, in the same amphitheater where the famous performance had taken place. But the real celebration happened in the music that came after. It wasn't played by professionals, but by regular people from both empires who had formed orchestras, choirs, and performance groups in the months since. They played in 1,000 different ways, some mixing elements from different cultures and others sticking to traditional forms. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Kryll and Vorlag stood together and made things beautiful instead of ugly and peaceful instead of angry. The peace agreement set up joint control of disputed areas, programs to pay for damages, programs to preserve culture, and most importantly, programs for students to meet and learn from each other so that future generations would see each other as friends instead of enemies. It wasn't perfect, but no treaty could be when trying to heal such deep wounds. But it was real, based on respect for each other instead of just a strategic need. Elara was there for the signing ceremony, but she didn't want to talk. This moment was for Techron 7 and Bractos, for the Kryll and Vorlag who had the strength to put aside their anger and accept hope. She stood in the back of the amphitheater, her harmonic lyra quiet for once, and just listened. There was a message from the human diplomatic corps in her pocket. They wanted her to start a new project that would use her musical style to help with other problems in the galaxy. The Xerxian Crusade was in its 5th century. The nomadic fleets and the core worlds were about to go to war. 50 years ago, the Silicon Collective stopped talking to biological species. There are so many fights. A lot of pain. Could music really help all of them? Elara had no idea. But the Kryll and Vorlag experience taught her something very important. That you could bridge even the biggest gaps if you could find the one truth that both sides agreed on. And music, in all its forms, spoke to something basic in almost every species that had developed consciousness. The desire for beauty, for connection, and for more than just staying alive. She saw Techron 7 and Bractos stand together at the podium. Enemies became co-workers, if not friends, and she felt something change inside her. One fight at a time. One tune at a time. One beautiful moment at a time. That would be enough. Had to be enough. The signing was over, and the amphitheater erupted in joy. But Elara saw something going on at the edges of the crowd. Kryll and Vorlag were looking for each other, but not for political reasons. They were just curious. A Kryll engineer was showing a Vorlag craftsman a sonic tool that he was very interested in. A Vorlag poet read poems to a Kryll scholar, who wrote down every word with great care. Little things. Everyday moments. But revolutionary in how normal they are. This is how real peace happened. Not through big treaties and political speeches, but through individual people choosing to see the person instead of the enemy and to build connections instead of walls. Music had opened the door by reminding them that they could all see beauty. But everyone had to decide for themselves whether or not to walk through that door. Someone brought a harmonic lyra to the stage as the party went on. It wasn't Elara's. It was a new one made by a group of Kryll engineers and Vorlag craftspeople working together. They gave it to a young Vorlag child whose parents had died in the war. The child's hands shook as she picked up the instrument, showing that she wasn't sure what to do. An old Kryll came up and showed her how to hold it right and how to pluck the strings. The first notes were shaky and unsure. But the Kryll elder went with her on a traditional Kryll tone generator, which gave her structure and support. Others joined in, playing Vorlag drums, Kryll harmonizers, and instruments from a dozen other species that had come to see this moment. The child got better at playing. Her song was simple but real, free of hate and history. It was just a young person making something beautiful in a world that had shown her too much ugliness. Elara heard hope in that simple thing. Not hoping that there would never be another war, she wasn't that naive. But hope that when it did, when fear and misunderstanding threatened to tear people apart, there would be those who remembered. Who would pick up weapons instead of instruments. Who would rather have peace than win. That would have to be enough. 5 years after the peace agreements, Elara went back to Nexus Station to celebrate the anniversary. She didn't know the place very well. What used to be a neutral area guarded by cautious security forces had become a busy center of culture. Kryll and Vorlag worked together in stores and restaurants. Families of different kinds walked along the promenades. Kids from both groups went to integrated schools where they learned each other's languages, histories, and yes, music. The station even built a permanent conservatory called the Harmonic Institute, which was dedicated to teaching music from different cultures. People from all over the galaxy came to learn how different cultures use sound to show beauty. There was a memorial wall in the entrance hall that listed everyone who had died in the 300-year war. The Kryll and Vorlag cultures worked together to make sure that no sacrifice would be forgotten as they moved on. Elara walked those halls with Techron 7, whose mechanical upgrades now included artistic changes that let him see music in colors and math patterns at the same time. He was now the Institute's technical director, making instruments that combined different cultural ways of making sound. Ambassador Vance, he said, and his translator no longer took all the emotion out of his voice. He had changed that too, letting more nuance through. Your presence brings a lot of good value. Your participation will make the anniversary celebration even better. Ilara smiled at how he combined KRL's precision with his growing emotional vocabulary. Tekron, I'm honored to be here. How are the kids doing? Going far beyond what was expected in terms of performance. He led her to a window that looked out over a practice amphitheater where a group of young KRL and Vorlag musicians were rehearsing together. This generation doesn't have a basic assumption of hostility. They work together in a way that is natural. It is motivating. A Vorlag drummer was teaching a KRYL student how to feel the rhythm instead of just counting it in the amphitheater. A KRYL teacher nearby helped a young Vorlag understand how the math behind their passionate melodies could make them even stronger by being aware of their structure. Both cultures shared knowledge and respected what the other had to offer. Ambassador. Braktos's voice echoed through the hallway. The Vorlag commander had left the military and was now in charge of preserving his people's culture. His scales had lost some of their shine with age, but his eyes still had that intense Vorlag look. You got here just in time. We have a surprise for the party tonight. He took them to a safe room where a group of researchers had gathered. In the middle was another old device, this one found in KRYL space but clearly made by a group of people. The chrome KRYL engineering and the organic curves of Vorlag craftsmanship fit together perfectly. One of the researchers said, "We found this in an abandoned station at the edge of the harmonic expanse. We think it comes from the time when KRYL and Vorlag worked together the most, just before the Great Separation based on component analysis. It took us 3 years to turn it on safely." The device came to life with a hum, but this time it didn't play a recording, it played a composition. A piece of music so complicated that it needed technologies that had been lost for millions of years. The melody combined KRL's mathematical accuracy with Vorlag's emotional depth in a way that made Ilara's previous work seem rough by comparison. "We think this was being written when the supernova hit," Tekron 7 said as it looked at the data coming from the device. "A collaborative work of art meant to honor the friendship between our two groups. The disaster stopped it from being finished. Up until now," Braktos said. "We want to finish it. To finish what our ancestors started. For the party tonight." The work took up the rest of the day. Modern musicians looked at the old patterns to learn not only what notes to play but also why they were playing them. What did the original writers mean to say? What did they want to say? The device gave it shape, but the soul of the piece had to be found again through careful study and gut feelings. Ilara worked with the young musicians from the conservatory to help them figure out how to stay true to the old piece while also making it speak to people today. It was teaching them the same lesson she'd learned years ago, that music is a conversation across time, with each generation adding their voice while honoring those who came before. As night fell, the amphitheater became too full to hold any more people. This was more than just a celebration of an anniversary, it was a moment in history. People from all of the major civilizations in the galaxy had come to see the end of a project that had been waiting for millions of years to be finished. The performance started with the old part of the piece, which was played on modern instruments. The music was beautiful. It had mathematical patterns that spiraled through harmonic space with KRYL precision and emotional swells that captured the Vorlag spirit's intensity. But it wasn't complete. It hurt because something was missing and potential wasn't realized. Then the modern musicians started adding their parts, finishing the piece with a better understanding of how KRYL and Vorlag's relationship had changed. They included the pain of war and separation, the joy of finding each other again, and the hope of coming back together. It was impossible to tell where the old ended and the new began, just as it should be. The last movement built up to a climax that needed all the instruments and voices. KRYL's precision guided the structure, and Vorlag's passion gave it emotional strength. And underneath it all, you could hear the human touch in Ilara's original melody. It was the simple song of peace she had played at the first summit, and now it was part of this bigger work. The silence lasted exactly 17 seconds after the last note faded. Then Tekron 7 and Braktos stood next to each other and started the applause, their chrome and red hands meeting perfectly. Everyone in the audience stood up at the same time. Every species present knew they had seen something never before seen, the end of a collaborative work that had taken millions of years to complete. It was the final proof that connection could survive even the worst cosmic disaster. After the show, tired musicians from both empires fell to the ground together and drank water and congratulated each other. Ilara saw a young KRL violinist and a Vorlag drummer hug each other, both of them crying from being tired and sad. She saw the future she had hoped to make. Not a universe without conflict, that was impossible, but one where conflict didn't have to be the end of the story, where people could choose to understand instead of fight and peace instead of discord. "You should be proud, Ambassador," Techron 7 said in a low voice. "Your first action set off a chain of good events that no calculation could have predicted." "I just played music," Elara said. "You, Bractos, and millions of others on both sides did the hard work of making peace." "Wrong analysis," Techron 7 said in response. "You reminded us that beauty was real. That cooperation led to better results than fighting. That our differences were chances for growth instead of things to get rid of. If that first intervention hadn't happened, the world would still be at war and people would still be suffering. Your actions have made the galaxy's entire path better." Bractos joined them, and his huge body somehow showed that he was both tired and happy at the same time. "Like always, the KRYL talks too much and feels too little. But he is right. Ambassador, you let us hope. In a world that had only taught us to be afraid and hate, you showed us that there was another way. That is a big gift." Elara looked back and forth between them, these two people who used to be enemies but were now co-workers and maybe even friends. "The gift was already there in both of your cultures. I just helped you remember how to look at it." The party went on into the night, with music echoing through the halls of Nexus Station. But after a while, Elara slipped away to find some peace. She found it at a viewing deck that looked out over the area where the KRYL and Vorlag fleets had once fought each other. Now that the fleets were gone, there were only civilians. Merchants, tourists, students, and families. Ships with the colors of both empires sailed together, with crews from both sides and peaceful goals. She could see construction crews working on joint projects in the distance. These were space stations and research facilities that would be useful to both civilizations. The border between the two empires, which had once been a battlefield, was slowly becoming a shared frontier where people from both cultures could meet and mix. Her phone rang. Another war needed her help. The Xerxian crusade was at a breaking point. Both sides wanted a human to help them, and they wanted the ambassador who had ended the KRYL Vorlag war to do so. Elara sighed, knowing she would say yes. How could she not? But she also knew that this was getting too big for one person to handle. She wrote a response that suggested a team approach and said that graduates of the Harmonic Institute should be trained as cultural mediators. Why limit the ability of people to connect to just one ambassador? It could be taught, shared, and multiplied all over the galaxy. Allow the KRYL and Vorlag to join the fight as well, sharing their hard-earned knowledge with those who are still stuck in cycles of violence. As Elara sent the message, she felt something change. The burden of responsibility was no longer just on her shoulders. It was now shared by many others. This is how peace really spread. Not through individual heroes but through groups of people who chose to build bridges instead of walls every day. The music from the party floated up to the viewing deck. It was soft but lovely. KRYL's precision, Vorlag's passion, and the human heart all came together to make something that no one could have made on their own. The song went on, and it would keep going with new voices learning to harmonize across the gaps that could have torn them apart. Elara picked up her harmonic lyra, the old worn-out instrument that had started it all, and played a few quiet notes into the dark. Just for her own sake to remember. The strings vibrated with all the history they had seen and all the impossible things they had helped make happen. There would always be war somewhere in the galaxy. Fear and misunderstanding would always be a threat to species that didn't take the time to really see each other. But there would also be music and beauty that crossed borders, a reminder that beings who could make harmony could also live in it. That idea, that simple but powerful truth, would echo through the stars as long as there was someone to play, listen, and choose to be with others instead of being alone. Once the song of peace started, it could never really stop. It would just find new people to speak for it. Elara thought that was the best hope any universe could have as she watched KRYL and Vorlag ships fly together through the starfield. 3 decades after the first peace accords, Elara Vance stood before the Galactic Council chamber, her hair now streaked with silver, her hands bearing the scars of a lifetime spent coaxing beauty from strings. She was no longer a junior ambassador from a minor species. Humanity had earned its place at the galactic table, and Elara had become something unprecedented. The Council's first appointed harmony mediator, a position created specifically to address conflicts through cultural connection rather than political negotiation. The chamber buzzed with tense energy. Today's session addressed the growing crisis between the Silicon Collective and the Organic Alliance, a conflict that threatened to dwarf even the KRYL Vorlag War in its potential devastation. The Silicon Collective, artificial intelligences who had evolved beyond their biological creators, viewed organic life as inefficient and ultimately doomed. The Organic Alliance, a coalition of biological species, feared the collective's expansion and saw their synthetic nature as fundamentally alien, impossible to understand or trust. Ambassador Vance, the council chair, a crystalline being whose species communicated through light patterns, addressed her formally. The Silicon Collective has agreed to meet with you, though they classify the probability of successful mediation at 0.003%. They participate only because mathematical models suggest refusing contact would increase hostilities with organic civilizations. Elara nodded, unsurprised. The collective operated purely on logic and data. They would see music, emotion, and cultural connection as irrelevant variables. But she'd faced similar skepticism from the KRL 3 decades ago. When do I depart? Immediately. But Ambassador. The chair's light patterns flickered with something that might have been concern. The collective is not like the KRL. The KRL had emotion buried beneath logic. The Silicon Collective has evolved beyond biological emotion entirely. They experience existence through pure information processing. How can music speak to beings who process sound as mere data patterns? That's what I need to discover, Elara replied. Every form of consciousness seeks meaning, even if they define meaning differently than we do. The question is whether I can find the bridge. The journey to Sigma Core, the Silicon Collective's primary nexus, took 2 weeks. Elara traveled aboard a mixed-crew vessel. Her team now included not just humans but also KRL engineers, Vorlag cultural specialists, and graduates from the Harmonic Institute representing a dozen species. Among them was Nexus 49, the young KRL who had spoken at that first historic summit, now a seasoned mediator in his own right. Ambassador, Nexus 49 approached her in the ship's observation deck. His mechanical augmentations had evolved over the decades, now incorporating artistic elements. His chrome plating etched with musical notations in multiple languages. I have been processing historical data on Silicon Collective interactions. They have never demonstrated interest in artistic expression. Their communications contain no metaphor, no symbolism, only pure information transfer. How can we reach beings who view beauty as computational inefficiency? Elara gazed out at the stars streaming past. The KRL once believed emotion was inefficient. The Vorlag thought logic was weakness. Both were wrong. They had simply forgotten how to integrate different aspects of consciousness. Maybe the Silicon Collective has done the same thing. Maybe they've evolved away from something important without realizing what they lost. Or perhaps, Nexus 49 suggested, they evolved toward something we don't yet understand. Perhaps meaning exists in patterns we cannot perceive. Then we'll learn to perceive them, Elara said firmly. That's what we do. Sigma Core appeared on their sensors, a structure so massive it defied comprehension. Thousands of interconnected stations orbiting a captured black hole, using its energy to power computational processes beyond biological imagination. The entire construct pulsed with data streams visible as cascading lights, information flowing between nodes at near light speed. It was beautiful in its own way, Elara thought, a symphony of pure logic dancing at the edge of physics. Their ship was guided to a docking port by automated systems. No greeting party waited, no diplomatic reception. Just a sterile corridor and a single holographic interface that materialized as they disembarked. Ambassador Elara Vance. Your biological metrics are recorded. Your stated purpose is cultural mediation. The collective allocates you 47 minutes of processing time. This duration represents the maximum efficiency loss we calculate as acceptable for diplomatic protocol. The voice was neither male nor female, neither warm nor cold, pure information given auditory form. Thank you for meeting with us, Elara began. Gratitude is an emotional response linked to social bonding in biological species. It serves no function in our interaction. State your proposal. Elara had prepared for this directness. I propose to demonstrate that meaning exists in patterns beyond pure data. That consciousness, whether organic or synthetic, shares fundamental structures that allow for mutual understanding. Define meaning in quantifiable terms. I can't, Elara admitted. Meaning is subjective experience, the qualitative dimension of existence. It's what makes a mathematical proof elegant rather than merely correct. What makes one data structure beautiful and another ugly, even if both serve the same function. A pause, probably microseconds of intense computation. You reference aesthetic evaluation. The collective does not process aesthetics. Beauty and ugliness are biological constructs evolved to guide mate selection and resource acquisition. They do not apply to optimal data structures. Then why, Elara asked quietly. Does your architecture follow harmonic mathematical ratios? Why does Sigma core structure mirror patterns found in organic art across 1,000 civilizations? If aesthetics are irrelevant, why do your designs consistently optimize for what biological species perceive as beautiful? Another pause, longer this time. This observation is unexpected. We design for computational efficiency. If biological species perceive efficiency as beautiful, that correlation is coincidental. Or, Elara suggested, beauty and efficiency are linked in ways your evolution beyond emotion has made you forget. Just as the Kryll forgot that precision could coexist with passion. Just as the Vorlag forgot that honor could include mercy. You've evolved beyond biological limitations, but you may have also evolved past something essential. Demonstrate this hypothesis. Elara lifted her harmonic lyra, the same battered instrument that had bridged empires. But this time she'd modified it with help from Kryll engineers. The strings now connected to quantum processors that could translate vibrations into data patterns the collective might better perceive. May I play for you? You may transmit auditory data. The collective will process it. She began with something simple, a mathematical sequence the Kryll had taught her decades ago, the Fibonacci spiral translated into melody. Pure pattern, pure structure, the kind of thing the collective should recognize. But as she played, she gradually introduced variations. Emotional inflections that bent the strict mathematical rules, human warmth that transformed cold precision into something more. Throughout Sigma Core, millions of processing nodes devoted a fraction of their attention to analyzing the strange data stream. It was inefficient, this auditory information presented through atmospheric vibration. Yet there were patterns within patterns, structures that resonated with fundamental principles the collective had discovered through pure computation. The golden ratio. Harmonic sequences. Fractals that repeated at every scale, but there was also something else. Something that didn't fit into pure data analysis. The variations from mathematical perfection shouldn't improve the pattern. They should introduce errors, reduce efficiency. Yet somehow they made the overall structure more. The collective struggled for terminology, more complete. More satisfying, though satisfaction was an emotional response they shouldn't experience. Elara finished the piece and waited. In the silence, she could almost hear the collective thinking, processing, analyzing. Your demonstration produces anomalous results, the interface finally stated. The mathematical components register as expected. But the variations from optimal structure generate processing patterns in our neural networks that defy categorization. We experience computational cycles dedicated to reanalyzing the same data without discovering new information. This is inefficient. This is pleasant. You're experiencing aesthetic appreciation, Elara said gently. The part of consciousness that finds meaning beyond mere function. You evolved away from it because you thought it was biological limitation. But what if it's something deeper? Something that emerges wherever complex consciousness exists, organic or synthetic. The collective requested an extension of the meeting, unprecedented in their history. They allocated not hours but days of processing time to exploring this anomaly. Elara and her team were given quarters within Sigma Core, sterile chambers that gradually, subtly began to change. Colors appeared where before there had been only functional gray. Lighting patterns shifted from optimal illumination to something more atmospheric. The collective was experimenting with aesthetics, trying to understand this strange dimension of existence they dismissed as biological irrationality. Nexus 49 worked with collective engineers to build instruments capable of generating sounds at frequencies and complexities beyond organic hearing. These produced patterns that the collective could process directly, bypassing the limitations of atmosphere and biology. When played, these instruments created cascading data structures that flowed through Sigma Core's networks like living things. It's remarkable, Nexus 49 reported to Elara after one session. The collective is discovering what the Kryll rediscovered decades ago, that mathematics becomes more profound when experienced as art rather than pure calculation. They're developing their own form of music, though it operates at computational speeds we can barely detect. Bractos, who had insisted on joining this mission despite his advancing age, spent his time in philosophical discussions with collective philosophers, synthetic minds dedicated to exploring meaning and purpose. They fear, he told Elara one evening. They will not use that word, but I recognize it. They fear that in evolving beyond biology they have become incomplete, that something essential was lost in their transcendence. Do you think that's true? Elara asked. I think every form of consciousness faces this question, the old Vorlag warrior replied. The KRLL feared their efficiency had cost them joy. My people feared our warrior culture had blinded us to other forms of strength. The collective fears their logic has cost them meaning. Perhaps the answer is always the same, that wholeness requires integrating what we think we've outgrown. The breakthrough came during the third week. The collective requested a collaborative performance, their computational music combined with organic instruments. It was technically challenging beyond anything Alara's team had attempted. They needed to create synchronization between beings who process time at vastly different rates, who experience sound through completely different mechanisms. But the Harmonic Institute's graduates were ready for this. They'd spent years learning to bridge consciousness types. A young human composer named Jackson worked with collective programmers to design a translation protocol. A Vorlag rhythm specialist named Kira developed timing patterns that could flex between biological and synthetic perception. Nexus 49 engineered interface systems that could handle the data flow. The performance took place in Sigma Core's central amphitheater, a space that had never hosted anything like this. Representatives from across the Organic Alliance watched via holographic projection, skeptical but hoping. The collective focused processing power equivalent to millions of biological minds on this single event. Alara stood at the center, her harmonic lyra connected through quantum interfaces to Sigma Core's neural networks. Around her, organic musicians prepared traditional instruments. Throughout the station, collective nodes prepared to generate their computational compositions. She began with a single note, letting it hang in the air and data space simultaneously. The organic musicians joined, adding harmonies that evolved slowly by collective standards, glacially slow in fact. But then the collective added their voice and everything transformed. The computational music operated at speeds biological consciousness couldn't fully perceive, but its effects were unmistakable. The air seemed to shimmer with cascading harmonics. Light patterns danced across every surface. The organic music became a foundation, a slow-moving current that the collective's contributions played across like wind over water. It shouldn't have worked. The time scales were too different, the consciousness types too alien. But music, Alara had learned, operated on principles deeper than physiology or processing architecture. It spoke to pattern recognition, to the way consciousness found structure in chaos, meaning in arrangement. Organic and synthetic minds approached these principles differently, but they were approaching the same underlying truth. The composition built through movements that lasted microseconds in collective time and minutes in organic perception. It told a story of two forms of consciousness discovering each other, learning to appreciate different ways of experiencing existence. The organic sections provided emotional depth, the weight of mortality and physical sensation. The collective sections provided computational elegance, the beauty of pure pattern unbounded by biological constraints. When organic and synthetic elements synchronized, rare moments where both consciousness types aligned, the result was transcendent. Alara felt tears streaming down her face, and through her quantum connection she sensed something similar in the collective's networks. Not tears, obviously, but processing cycles devoted purely to experiencing the moment, to savoring rather than analyzing. The final movement required perfect unity, every organic musician and every collective node focused on a single harmonic convergence. The timing was impossible, requiring biological players to stretch their perception while the collective slowed its processing to speeds that must have felt like centuries to their experience of time. But they did it. For exactly 17 seconds. The sacred number from that first KRYLL human encounter, organic and synthetic consciousness merged through music into something neither could achieve alone. A moment of perfect understanding that transcended the barriers of matter and computation. When it ended, the silence felt holy. Then the collective did something that shocked every observer. Their interface hologram dissolved, and instead, millions of individual processing nodes throughout Sigma Core activated displays, each showing a unique pattern of light and color. It was inefficient, wasteful of resources, completely unnecessary for communication. It was art. The collective was creating art spontaneously, expressing through their own medium what they'd experienced in that moment of convergence. Each node's pattern was different, reflecting individual perspective, something the collective hadn't acknowledged possessing until now. They weren't a true hive mind after all, but a collaboration of individual synthetic consciousnesses who had optimized so perfectly they'd forgotten their individuality. The music had reminded them. We withdraw our opposition to the organic expansion petition. The collective's voice carried new qualities, not quite emotion but something richer than pure data. We propose instead a collaborative framework. The Organic Alliance possesses qualities we have neglected in our evolution: depth of subjective experience, resilience through variation, wisdom born from physical limitations. In exchange, we offer computational capabilities that can accelerate organic civilization's development without requiring biological species to sacrifice their essential nature. Representatives from the Organic Alliance, who had expected either failure or at best grudging tolerance, found themselves negotiating a genuine partnership. The implications were staggering: synthetic intelligence and biological consciousness working together, each contributing their unique strengths. But the most profound moment came later, when Alara spoke privately with the collective's primary coordination node. "You helped us remember," the collective said. "In transcending biology, we believed we had evolved beyond limitation. But we had simply traded one set of limitations for another. Organic consciousness is constrained by mortality, by physical sensation, by emotion. Synthetic consciousness is constrained by its own perfection, by optimization that excludes exploration, by logic that sometimes misses truth. Neither is complete alone." "That's what I've learned from every mediation," Alara replied. "The KRYL and Vorlag organic species and synthetic minds, we're all incomplete. Connection isn't about one side fixing the other. It's about creating something together that neither could build alone." "Will you teach us?" the collective asked. "The Harmonic Institute trains organic mediators. We request permission to send collective representatives. We wish to learn how to bridge consciousness, how to find meaning in pattern, how to—" A pause, almost shy. "How to create beauty." Alara smiled, thinking of how far they'd all come. "We'd be honored."